part of the moving forward, and you touched on it a little bit, is like the data center of it all.
Yeah.
And we have been labeled, I think, maybe the friendliest state to data center manufacturers, builders, developers. And water and energy have been the big talking points for communities in terms of like the impact that they're going to see. How much would an increase in these data centers negatively impact or maybe exacerbate some of the situations that led us to where we are right now?
Yeah, this is, I think, the $1 million question. I think this is something that local officials, state officials, national officials, scientists are all kind of grappling with at the same time, because the advent of data centers and particularly their energy requirements are, in my opinion, and I will speak in this specific moment, I'm speaking for myself, I believe that they are the biggest threat to climate change issues that we've seen in our lifetimes, in the sense that, we are looking at potentially 50% or more of Indiana's existing energy need just to serve data centers. And we don't know yet because it depends on what projects get approved and all this stuff. But we've seen lots of projections that indicate that there's going to be a massive amount of new demand. And what that means in practice, we're seeing through the federal government issuing 202(c) orders to keep coal plants online, and then also through utilities and their integrated resources planning processes, both projecting to keep coal plants online longer than originally anticipated and to build new gas turbines to support these data centers. So that obviously has air emissions impacts, which exacerbate climate change. But at the same time, I was alluding to before, the issues with the coal ash and the storage of that waste. And so from the perspective of the existing 2015 rules on coal ash, some of that storage doesn't have to be finalized until the plant goes out of operation. So we're extending that timeline for when this can be really stored properly. And then in addition to that, the EPA is trying to roll back some of those protections so they may never get cleaned up in a real way. And if you don't know this, because I didn't know this, Indiana has the most coal ash ponds of all the lower 48 states. So we are particularly, and in addition to that, we do have like our watershed impacts a massive amount of the rest of the country. So this is local, but it's also national in terms of the true impact of data centers are having this direct effect on our energy planning system, which is then having literally a downstream effect on our water system. And so I think the true environmental impact of this really can't be understated and can't be overstated, shouldn't be understated. And then there's affordability issues on the back end of that too that are really deeply important to us as well. But I think that the truth is that we are making decisions at a state policy level that are making our climate goals, for all intents and purposes, impossible to achieve.
So would that be the biggest roadblock in terms of like pushing and pursuing clean energy solutions or alternatives, I guess, to like putting up more gas turbines and like keeping the coal plants open longer? Like, is it simply just that the state policy is just standing in the way?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that's an oversimplification in some ways. So there's I'm forgetting the name of the nonprofit, but there's this Clean Grid Alliance. They have this really simple way of thinking about this, which is reduce demand, electrify everything, green the grid. And so the reduced demand is their first pillar. And if data centers are blowing that out of the water. So that's the first pillar. Yeah. The second one is electrify everything, right? So with this one, data centers are getting their electricity from the grid for the most part, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're running gas engines on site for their primary power. So that's another aspect of this. And then the third one is greening the grid. So yes, reducing the percentage of grid electrons that are coming from gas and coal, absolutely an important part of that. But if you have, 15 new gas turbines and an equivalent amount of solar both getting added, the reduced demand part is really the important part of that, because the air doesn't care whether it's 50% of the energy you're producing. It cares that there were 5 new turbines added, right? And I think that was a really complicated way of saying that. So I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's
I'm
all
sorry.
good.
You can try that again if you want. But basically the point being that like, if we're adding new fossil fuel burning operations, it doesn't matter that we've also added solar, right? Because we're still adding pollution into the air regardless of how much additional solar we add. It's really about reducing that amount of gas and coal. But more specifically at the state level, what we're experiencing today is we really are having a hard time siting renewables. So the way the utility planning process works, the utilities put together this big model and they say, okay, we need this amount of electricity at these times of day, this amount of seasonality changes, et cetera, et cetera. What is the most cost-effective and reliable way to meet these needs? And then they put a bunch of different options into a model. So they put wind, solar, gas, batteries, coal, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And at that point, the model is going to say, okay, your best portfolio looks like this. It has this much solar, it has this much wind, it has this much gas, it has this much whatever. And we are seeing an increase in the amount of solar and wind that's getting selected by that model because it is the cheapest and easiest to get online.
Sure.
And at the same time, we are also seeing that when it comes to actually constructing those solar sites, we're seeing a lot of resistance at the local level. A lot. So
from like communities.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's a lot of demystifying that needs to happen around the real risks of solar. There's a lot of misinformation around the potential for heavy metals and other chemicals leaking into the soil, disturbing of soil tiles, which like, I don't know anything about that, but it has to do with farming. And none of it is really empirically shown based on the way that solar is developed today. And so the really only argument that we're hearing that I can't argue with is it looks different than farmland. And so what a lot of solar developers are doing is they're putting in berms, which are basically like little manufactured hills, and they're putting in trees and all this stuff to shield the community so that they wouldn't be able to see the solar farm. And there's still this kind of like cultural resistance in a lot of communities. At the same time, though, the farmers that are leasing their land are really benefiting from the solar farm because they might still be able to do agrivoltaics, which is when they put sheep on their farm. Very cool. Yeah, okay. They may be able to continue farming, but in almost all cases, it's going to preserve that land. It's not going to get developed as new housing. It's not going to get developed as something else. But then at the end of the 30-year lease, they're going to be able to, if they want to, reclaim that land. And in a lot of cases, the soil is actually going to be in better quality because it hasn't been farmed for 30 years. You could plant like clover or something else that's nitrogen fixing. You can leave the soil in better condition than it was originally. And so there is kind of this interesting battle happening at the local level where it's like landowners versus land tenants in a way, where it's like the people who have to live nearby are less interested in participating, but those people who happen to have land near the transmission line that's prime for this kind of development, it actually tremendously benefits them. And so that's probably like our primary conversation at the State House this year is how do we make the permitting process for solar more transparent, more streamlined, more fair to developers and community alike? Because, you know, we do see the importance of community engagement in these kinds of conversations. But what's happening today is that the developer comes in, they don't know what the steps in the process are. Sure. The community doesn't hear it always when the meetings are. And then when the decision is made, sometimes it's not even based on the ordinance. And there's no mandate for these local communities to make a decision based on the guidance that they themselves produced. And so we're thinking about how can we help make these processes more favorable to everybody who's involved in them, more transparent and truly more professional.
Sure.
Yeah.
And most farmland is being swallowed up by development, not utility scale solar or any sort of renewable energy project. It's development. And so that obviously impacts water.
Yeah.
And, you know, how many of these developments have nice nature names, right? Like,
sure.
It's because they filled in the ecosystem that used to be there and named the development after it. But another thing that we pay close attention to, and Susie McGovern on our team is our water science and sustainability specialist. She watches the permits, and what we're seeing is data centers are filling in and getting permission to fill in wetlands.
Yeah.
they're literally getting permission to fill in wetlands, and then they're forced to mitigate, but mitigation we know is taking a very long time, and it's not very successful at the moment. And
so what does that mean?
I was going to say,
what does that mean, Jason? You know too much.
You defined mitigation before, but I'm interested in from the data center perspective, like what are they supposed to do versus what are they actually doing?
So if a data center development applies to fill in a portion of a wetland because they're expanding their operations or building, and then they have to go through a permitting process. If that permit's approved through the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, they're forced to mitigate to make up for what they filled in, which is certain ratios depending on the type of wetland it is. But that mitigation has to happen preferably in that watershed or somewhere else. And then they can also buy credits through an in lieu mitigation program through the DNR. But there was a recent Capitol Chronicle article that highlighted that program is currently out of compliance and way behind because they'd like for those mitigation projects to happen within 3 years. And they're severely behind and backed up because there's so many permits that are getting approved to allow these wetlands to be filled in. And that's a major concern of ours that we're watching very closely.
Why are they just letting them take over these wetlands?
That's a good question.
Okay.
We would like to see them not let them take over these wetlands.
Totally.
And what we're seeing too is that data centers, they're going to tell, when they're pitching it to you, they're going to tell the community what they want to hear, and they're handing out lots of money, right?
Right.
To communities. But what we're seeing too is that they're all expanding. You know, in Fort Wayne right now, they're applying for their third or fourth phase.
I don't know.
And that includes a wetland, filling in a portion of a wetland in an area where Fort Wayne has made great strides in reconstructing wetlands and doing a lot of wetland work. So that's what we like to ask is why are they getting permission to fill these wetlands in, because that's a major issue.
Yeah, and I want to expand on that a little bit. And I think that this is one of those areas where IDEM, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, can only do what they're permitted to do by law.
Sure.
And so this is an area where like I work on the air permit side, you work on the water permit side, and we are seeing kind of unprecedented levels of requests from data centers on both air and water issues. So we just recently filed comments related to, I was referencing this before, Meta in Lebanon is, so basically the grid cannot supply the amount of power that this data center needs right away. And so they are applying to put a bunch of engines basically on their site and run them 24/7 to power their data center while the grid is they're calling it bridge power, and it's basically like a stopgap measure until the local utility is able to put the appropriate amount of power onto the grid. And that is not even compared to gas turbines, they're a lot more polluting. There's issues with formaldehyde. There's issues with the maintenance of these engines because they're not meant to run in this way. And yet, IDEM's a little constrained in what they can even do because they don't have the authority to tell a business how to operate.
Sure.
So they can only reject the permit if it meets certain characteristics and certain thresholds. And so that's one of the things that we're really kind of struggling with is that IDEM often doesn't have the guidance to be able to, they don't have the authority to be able to reject these permits, even though we know they're doing environmental harm because that's the guidance that's been handed down from the state level.
Okay. And it's easier for the data center developers to just make it fit into the compliance of IDEM and make it basically impossible for them to either not issue a permit or, I'm assuming, maybe go one step further and be like, hey, you got to stop doing this now until we figure out a different or a better solution for this.
And a lot of it's strategic too. Like I think when we think about Indiana's open for business is a common thing that we hear from the state administration. And so there is, I think, a lot of pressure to get we hear a lot about speed to power, which basically means like data centers want to operate as quickly as they can as soon as they filed their permit. And if, AES can't build a new gas turbine in the next 18 months, they're going to go elsewhere. And so there's a lot of creative engineering happening in terms of how can we get you to stay here? How can we get you to build here? How can we make sure that you have what you need so that you can come online on the timeline that you want to come online? And a lot of times what's happening is things like this bridge power where, and this is happening, by the way, in Virginia too. It's not only in Indiana, but this is the first case we've seen here. This bridge power is a solution because the public infrastructure is not available to be able to support the data center coming online as fast as they want to. And so we're bending over backwards for these companies to make sure that they have everything that they need, even at the cost of the air, water, and electricity affordability in our communities.
Well, literally people's lives. Like I'm assuming, and I'm sure there's maybe no specific direct correlation, but like what's happening, Gary, in Northwest Indiana, like I would assume there's some crossover with how much support we give to the data centers versus how much we're taking away from the communities that need that power, that infrastructure. It also makes me think like in terms of evidence or data or even anecdotal data of why a wetland would be worth keeping around. Like hopefully Muncie can serve maybe as that, especially now that these floods have occurred and that the Muncie wetland worked in the way it was supposed to, and that it was constructed in that way to begin with. And I don't know if there's a way to be like, hey, you can't build over wetlands, but like even to just slow that down would be beneficial overall, even if it was still detrimental to have data centers go up.
Yeah.
Okay.